Welcome to Tenian's Corner for another After Hours Screen Talk. My name is Dan. With me, as always, is Tenian. Today, we're going to be discussing the final picture in Ty West's horror thriller trilogy, MaXXXine. I'm sure most of you are aware, but the first film was X, and the second film was called Pearl. So we're going to begin with a non-spoiler review, and then transition into a more in-depth discussion of the film that will include spoilers. So we'll try to remember to cue you to that when we get to that point. Ty West's vision for this trilogy is pretty unique. He wanted to not only tell generic horror stories, but also reflect on the role that film and media have played in generating images of horror. So with that in mind, each film invokes a different historical period of film. The first film, X, invokes the 1970s, and especially the porn boom that happened, where X-rated pictures like Deep Throat and others were actually some of the most financially successful films of their time. Pearl, the second film in the trilogy, invokes the early 20th century and also deals with the Technicolor melodramatic swing of films in the 1950s and 60s. This final film, MaXXXine, concludes with a strong invocation of the visual aesthetics and the ethic of the 1980s. I should mention that this film has a terrific cast. Mia Goth returns in the role of MaXXXine. She was phenomenal in the first two films. She's also really amazing in this film. As well, we have Giancarlo Esposito, who plays her sleazy but likable agent and lawyer.
He's a very
And then
good
we have
agent.
Yes, he's an amazing agent, right? He will do the job. He gets things done.
Mm.
And then we have the always really fascinating and provocative Kevin Bacon as a sleazy as heck private investigator who's one of the figures that dogs Maxine in her attempts to reach stardom. Just in the interest of giving you a basic setup, the film deals with Maxine after the trauma of the first film. She is now in Hollywood and is in the process of trying to establish herself as a mainstream movie star. She's already blown up as an adult film star. She's established in that respect, but she wants to emerge out from under the shadow of porn and actually become a tried and true mainstream star. She is cast amongst hundreds of contenders for the sequel to a exploitation horror film called The Puritan Part 2. While this is happening, however, she is haunted by her past. Not only is she experiencing memories of what happened in the initial film X, but she's also being stalked by an unseen figure who apparently has some kind of vendetta against her, is blackmailing her. And there's a lot of interesting things going on in this film. So, like the previous two films, it really wants to invoke the era and the film and media aesthetic that it's placed in. So
For
this
sure.
film lives and breathes the 1980s. So montages, the soundtrack, the sheen and the sizzle of the images has this unmistakably 1980s sense, this feel to it. On top of that, it's also really invoking current events. So the 1980s satanic panic figures really strongly in the plot of this film. We've also got the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. His crimes recur as an element in the film, although not in any direct way as concerns the plot. But Jesse, what was your reaction to the film? Where do you think it stacks up when you look at the first two in the trilogy?
Personally, I think X, um, that first installment, is a perfect balance between an avant-garde art house horror film mixed in with a B movie slasher movie. And it really balances those two elements very well. In this one, this film felt less cohesive when it's engaging in commentary and that kind of metatextual, self-referential commentary on the horror genre. A lot of the time it feels a little bit on the nose, like there's a very overt on the nose reference to Psycho, Hitchcock's Psycho. And I felt like those kinds of references, although clever, kind of held the film back from being its own thing and standing on its own. And
Mm,
also, I thought
mm,
the film also made the mistake at times of leaning too heavily on the nostalgia and peppering the film with a lot of 80s singles like Animotion's Obsession. Although I love the music, sometimes it felt like West was really getting into his greatest hits and playlists of the 80s, and the scenes were kind of playing to the music he was referring to rather than being an integral part of the story. And the horror elements too didn't quite work for me either, because I never felt like Mia Goth or MaXXXine, the character MaXXXine, was in any kind of peril or jeopardy.
I agree. I found this one of the three films, I think the least finished. The film looks great. I think it's a spectacularly pretty aesthetically effective film on the level of the visual. I mean, I think it has that sheen. There are scenes that remind me of the color palette of a film like Terrifier. Just looks great. But I'm with you when you're talking about the references, the songs, the appearance of brand names like Coca-Cola, and the way the logo looked in the 80s versus the way it's evolved slightly until the contemporary period. Those moments I think are not empty on an analytical and intellectual level. I think West was so interested in the conceptual nature of what he was doing by the third film that kind of takes over the film a little bit. It doesn't have the same visceral thrill that the first two films have. So I
Yeah.
feel this film very much in my brain, but not necessarily in my gut. Um, and I agree with you also. The Maxine character never seems truly challenged by the events in the film. With you as well, of the three films, it feels the least like a horror film to me. It feels much more like a psychological thriller, but it's lacking, I think, what the first two films bring, which is this sense of abhorrence and disgust at the aberrant behavior we're witnessing from the Pearl character. I think what this film is missing is the Pearl character, actually.
Yeah.
Well, Maxine is I mean still goth and in many ways a double for the Pearl character, but she's also unmistakably her own thing, right? She's not Pearl. She's not a grotesque figure, and I think that's what we're lacking. We're
Mm.
lacking the Pearl character, who is consistently a focal point of psychopathic, maniacal disgust. Like, her compulsions are unnatural and abhorrent and just endlessly fascinating for that reason. But Maxine's dream, that's the American dream. It's far too legible, right?
Mhm.
And maybe that's the film's strongest commentary is that, what does Maxine want? She wants the American dream. She's positively bourgeois. And yet nevertheless, it doesn't quite land in a strong way for me. Maxine seems a really highly successful character thematically, in a way that Pearl is not. Pearl invokes the classic kind of like crisis of modern horror, which is a crisis of subjectivity, right? She's trying to fully actualize herself, live a dream, or even just live a kind of bearable reality, and is always finds herself in the position of failing at those things. Whereas Maxine is the other side of that coin. She seems to eventually get everything that she wants and be exactly where she wants to be by the end of the film.
Yeah.
I think there's an intellectually stimulating idea there, a kind of point counterpoint dynamic between those two characters. Um, and yet it doesn't end up being as emotionally satisfying or psychologically fraught. So I find myself actually not uncomfortable enough by the end of the film
Mhm.
because I mean I'm rooting for Maxine. I didn't, uh, I'm pro sex work, and I think that her journey is a really interesting one on that level. The fact that she uses sex work as that springboard, and that sex work is not really actually demonized in this film, which is interesting. I mean, sex work is almost always demonized, especially in these types of films, and it really isn't in the same way here. At least I don't think it is. So I think that's interesting. But then again, that has to do with what I find politically correct, right? Um, what I think is interesting about the first two films is that they're willing to kind of like subvert the lines of political correctness and tell a story that gets under your skin. And if a film is totally politically correct, it's probably not going to get under your skin. All right, so spoiler portion of the video beginning now. Talking about Kevin Bacon, I think one of the things that was really frustrating for me about his character is number one, I think if you've got Kevin Bacon in your film, he is one of the potentially sleaziest characters, right, you'll ever have. He's really great at that. He's capable of being so sinister. and he brings it in this film. He's great in this film, but the character doesn't feature the way I think I would have tried to utilize it. You know, this character ostensibly is hired by the final villain character, this shadowy character in leather, who's eventually exposed to be, you know, he's realized we realize that we're watching a kind of Darth Vader figure here, because this is Maxine's father. So he's been hired by her dad to track her down and blackmail her and do things like that. Now, eventually he's attacked, viciously attacked by Maxine, and his face is disfigured by her, right? So she pisses him off, and maybe that's why he behaves the way he does. But like when he starts attacking her, trying to like on the film set, you know, trying to stalk her down, maybe shoot her. Eventually, he tries to assault her in a club, and that's eventually when, you know, that's the transition into how he meets his fate. But I just feel like that character as the private eye, sure, he's a sick creep, I have no doubt, but he also just wants to get paid, right? And
Yeah.
I don't see how killing Maxine is going to work for him, right? I mean, given what the agenda of Maxine's dad is at the end of the film, the Bacon behavior, I mean, unless that character has gone rogue, right? I mean, if we're supposed to think this character has gone rogue and he's just going to do what he wants, fair enough. But I don't personally read the character that way. I think he's just far too banal and self-serving to actually do anything that masochistic, because then he's going to be in trouble with his boss, right? Um, so yeah, I mean, and then of course the way he's dispatched too, which just feels like I'm going to say like the murders in this film are among the more disappointing element of it, because they seem kind of anticlimactic. They're not as juicy as the murders in the first two films.
I get that. Yeah, with Bacon's character, I think he's introduced as just another unhinged character to have fun with.
Mm,
I think there's also a joke with his character too, in that there's like a Chinatown reference where he gets his nose broken by
mhm.
Maxine and has that bandage around his nose, paying homage to Jack Nicholson's character in Chinatown. So again, a film referring to another film. Its style is very reminiscent of like a Tarantino film. I think the film was a little too self-involved in its nostalgic indulgences and
Mm.
style.
Puts paid to the idea that Tarantino's a really important director for our era. I mean, love him or hate him, and for the most part, I don't care for the films he makes after Jackie Brown, but his influence is very clear when you watch a film like this, right? The idea of that kind of metatextual, frustratingly constant analytical distance from what we're watching. I don't feel that in early Tarantino, but then for at some point he just withdraws into this echo chamber of cinephilia and reference, and that's where he lives so far has lived the rest of his career. And that's what I feel like Ty West has fallen into in this last entry in the trilogy, which the first two films are great, like we said. This one's good, right? I don't think it's a failure as a film per se, but it's certainly not as good as the first two. Now, the other thing I felt really disappointed by in this film, I don't know what your reaction was, but I saw the ending coming a mile away. It was never mysterious to me who this shadowy figure was. I always knew this is her dad. You know, that's the most obvious answer to this question of who's dogging her steps. Who else would it be? But he doesn't land as a character for me. I don't ever feel like he's a threat to Maxine, even when he has her tied to a post and is threatening to brand her. He never really feels like anything else than a two-dimensional stereotype. The thing that I find frustrating about the final villain as well is maybe this is again a kind of intellectually challenging commentary, but he's exactly the same way off camera as he is when he's making one of his videos. He's no different. Maybe there's a commentary there. Maybe this is a character we're meant to think that he is so mediated by the visual culture that he's a part of that he no longer has any selfhood apart from it. There's no divorcing him from the camera or from the video eye, because that's what he lives, thinks, and breathes, and there is no subjectivity for him outside of it. And yet, again, that's not really articulated in any clear way in the film, or at least I don't think it is.
Yeah.
I would have personally found him much scarier if he were a much quieter, more sinister, more cunning figure than he appears on camera. But on the other hand, maybe the most terrifying idea is that Jerry Falwell is exactly the same off camera as he was on it. Maybe
Yeah.
that is the scariest thing to consider.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. I get you. Yeah. I think again, with his character as established in the first X movie, you just see him on the TV. And when he was a more peripheral, shadowy figure, he had more of a presence. X just makes these kinds of puritanical readings of horror films like explicit, like the actual
Mhm.
psychopaths. Pearl and her husband, they're these crazy puritanical fanatics, except in this case, they're not just punishing, in this case, the adult film crew, but they're also envious and jealous of them. And I
Mhm.
think that's one of the unique twists that Ty West brings to the table into this particular horror subgenre and does that very well. Having his character be the main villain at the end works on an intellectual, conceptual level. It's perfectly fitting, but it feels a little too literal. Again, a little too on the nose. I mean, we've been talking mostly in a negative light on this film, and I just want to point out one of the things that I thought worked very well are those scenes where she's getting a full body cast made of herself by the special effects person,
Puts the mold on her.
the mold on her, yeah, and just leaves her there to let the mold harden. That was one of the most like tension-filled moments in the whole movie for me when she's having like flashbacks.
Now that scene, like you said, with the mole, that's a powerful scene. Not only because it is so psychologically affecting and visceral in a way that the rest of the movie isn't consistently that way. But also we see the momentary return of the Pearl character. Those hands come and start to massage her and work down towards her breasts, right? And that's Pearl again. That's the ghost of Pearl. There she is. This is the element we're missing in this film. We need Pearl back. But the other thing really, I think that's really fascinating about this film, and the other thing that's kind of half baked throughout the whole film is this question of actresses and aging that X, the very first film, raises. Um, the interview that is being conducted at the beginning of MaXXXine, they ask her why she wants to be in this film, and she says, "Well, I'm an adult actress. I'm 33 years old. Adult actresses in films age like bread, not wine." So the question of age is invoked right away there. And then in this mold scene, she's covered in this goop that makes her look wrinkly and melting. So
Yeah,
she's exactly where the Pearl character finds herself in the beginning, in the first film. Here is she's this dripping, melting corpse, and that seems, in a way, that almost seems like the source of the trauma, right? Here's this actress who wants to make it in Hollywood, but making it in Hollywood, how long do you get to make it, right? How long are you going to be that it girl? How long is your beauty going to last? That question hasn't gone anywhere. We're still reckoning with that, with actresses and women and girls in Hollywood today. So that was really interesting, but it's just for that moment, right? It's not really developed in the film.
that's a brilliant like analysis of that scene with the mold. And I noticed that while watching it that she looks old, and I never made that direct connection with Pearl though. And so that's very insightful.
And then the other thing I really love are the recurrent news montages where we're seeing, the rampage, the real life rampage of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, right? So we have this idea of Satanism, and we have this idea of violence against people, mostly women and children, by the way. And we have this idea that there's danger lurking around every corner, that the 80s are this decade of saturated by a kind of visual cult of violence, not only in our films but also in our reality, our mediated reality. And that's great. That's just that those moments really just, I say that not too many moments in this film land. Those moments land. They really do. And it reminds me of the best parts of a Paul Verhoeven, satire, or those moments that you see in 80s action films where we see this kind of hardcore satire encroaching on this action narrative. The point that this film is making about Hollywood and images and women and misogyny, I compare that to, for instance, Mulholland Drive, right? With, a David Lynch, or Inland Empire by David Lynch, for that matter. if you're going to make that argument, but go all in the way I think Lynch really does in those films, where he's really kind of like forcing us to live for these extended narratives in the distorted psyche of a female subject who is trying to find some place in this mediated industry that is itself part of a society mediated and over mediated by images and by image culture, and a culture in which women and girls are especially implicated and imperiled.
Yeah.
Um, and I think one of the things that doesn't quite hinder Lynch is that he's not politically correct, right? His films are saturated by messy kinds of un-PC elements, right? I mean, I think you could very easily accuse his films of misogyny, of wanton voyeurism, that they kind of fall head over heels into the seediness of what's unfolding. It's one of the reasons they work so well. They really are those fever dreams that we really crave. We talk about the dream factory of Hollywood. What I hope I get when I go in to see a great horror film is I just want to go head over heels off the rails into this space of complete and utter dangerous excess and self-implication.
Yeah, I
But
think
the experience of MaXXXine is too clean for me.
I was kind of like waiting for the film to really escalate, and it never quite escalated. Even Mia Goth's journey throughout the film, there's no like kind of propulsiveness to it.
No, it's a very actually sedate film, strangely enough. I mean, it's about the 80s, so it really should be about excess, right? But it never quite gets there.
Yeah. I think I was just like I said, just I was waiting for things to escalate, and it was like, oh, well, okay.
But you're exactly right, and I think that's a point that can't be made enough, is that Maxine doesn't have confrontations in this film. The closest she comes is that guy in the alleyway. But Kevin Bacon is dispatched by her lawyer. The detectives take out a lot of the fundamentalists, and then her dad is pretty much already dispatched. He's helpless when she gets there with the sawed off, and she shoots him in the head. But yeah, she doesn't have any great like final girl showdown moments for this film. All right, so this has been yet another After Hours Screen Talk with myself, Dan, and Tenian. This is Tenian's Corner. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. But we'll be sending more videos your way. You can expect more content from us.